My basic training for the Air Force was at Air Force Base. After that, I was sent to Shepherd Air Force Base for technical school. After my graduation, I received orders to McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey. There, my job was aerospace mechanic. At first, I started on the night duty, unfortunately, so my sleep schedule was basically non-existent. My duties basically were lugging plane parts like anti-ice valves, igniters, ignition exciters, sensors, and more from the warehouse to the flight line. It was, for the most part, boring, repetitive work, especially at night. A lot of sitting around and playing games on my phone, but nobody heard that from me. It had to be like 3 a.m. at this point. I was waiting for the other guy to come drop off some parts to the flight line. He'll be referred to as Dan for the purpose of this story. I was waiting by the back cargo area of the plane we were working on at the time, sitting on a box, scrolling through my phone. Dan was taking an incredibly long time with his delivery, so I shot him a few texts. When they went unresponded to, I tried calling him a few times. The calls rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. I figured he was either screening his calls, lost his phone, or was just very busy at the moment. I waited and waited and he never showed up. Eventually I got a call from Dan's number. So I picked up, but it wasn't Dan's voice on the other end. It was some random guy. He sounded like a grown man in his 45s. He said he saw I tried calling a few times and said he found this phone on the ground outside of the base. I described what Dan looked like and asked him if he had seen anyone who may have resembled him. He said he had not. It's not like he would have been allowed on the base, so my only option was to drive out there and meet him. I asked him where he was and he gave me the name of a nearby joint where I agreed to meet him. I walked to my car, which was parked in the closest parking lot, and I drove off the base towards the place he told me to meet him. While I was mid-drive, I remembered Dan was sharing his location with me. Long story, but we basically met these 2 girls this one night while off base, who we separated from each other with. We, as a joke, started sharing our locations with each other in case we got quote-unquote murdered, as we kept joking. We joked about it mainly because we met them at a sketchy dive bar, but I'm not about to get into that. The place the man on the phone told me to meet him was called Tony, the closest town to the base. I pulled up the location of Dan's phone, and it checked out. It showed Dan's phone location right next to Tony. This begged the question, what was that man doing there this late at this hour? The place wasn't open, and there were 0 cars on the road. I pulled into the little parking lot and parked. I stepped out and called Dan's phone again. The guy picked up and he spoke in a noticeably lower voice now. I told him I was in the parking lot of the pub, and he said he was as well. He said in almost a whisper, "I'll be right over," and he hung up. It was weirder in the moment than it sounds explaining it. I looked at the location on my phone to see if it was updating, but it seemed the location of Dan's phone was in the small patch of woods about 200 feet long and 200 feet wide. I tried calling again and it went straight to voicemail. I looked around the whole parking lot but didn't see anyone. I was all alone, not even an occasional passing car. I looked to the woods when I heard something over the sound of the crickets, like someone's footsteps, and then I saw a man. It was him. He was standing just behind the tree line between the woods and the parking lot. He called to me, "Are you alone?" The sight of him, only his upper body visible, was freaky as hell. I called back, "No, why?" as I inched my way closer to my car. This was one giant red flag. He called back, "Who are you with?" I didn't answer that. I got in my car and drove back to base. I called my supervisor and told him Dan was missing and someone was hiding in a patch of woods with his phone. My supervisor told me he was with Dan at that moment. He told me to meet them at the small building by the flight line. I met with the 2 and told them once again what I witnessed when tracking his phone. Dan told me what happened while off the base. He was approached by somebody outside of a 24/7 convenience store asking for a ride back to the base. Dan believed that he was actually in the Air Force at first and let him in the car. But as they were driving, the man asked Dan to pull over by the woods so he could pee real quick. Dan obliged for some reason. As Dan was pulled to the side of the road by the same small patch of woods by Tony, he wasn't paying attention for a minute and his door was opened by the man. Without a second to even react, the man was grabbing Dan's arms and squeezing them as he tried to pull him out of the car. Dan said he kicked at the man's groin area until he let go. He dropped his phone and it fell out of the car during the struggle, but as he was free, he drove the car away with the door still open at first. The next thing that happened was he went back to the base to talk with our supervisor. We, of course, called the police and all went to Tony to check if the man was still there. The location of Dan's phone was no longer popping up on the map. It's possible the man destroyed the phone. All we did was file a police report. Some people out there are actually crazy and dangerous. Who knows what he would have done to either of us if he had gotten us in the woods. This experience has left me very paranoid in a lot of ways. It was the late hours of the night. I could feel the thud of my heartbeat inside my chest as our armored vehicle veered off the gravel road, plowing through the dense underbrush. It had been weeks since Bravo unit had gone silent, vanishing like a wisp of smoke on a windy day. The distress call had crackled through our comms earlier, an unexpected sign of life from our long-missing comrades. But what haunted me more than their sudden re-emergence was the content of their message, a cryptic string of numbers repeating endlessly. "Sergeant Robert, are you sure this is the place?" I asked over the static hiss of the radio, cutting through the silence that had settled over our squad. "That's what command confirmed." "Get ready," Robert replied as our vehicle came to a halt. The dense fog seemed to get worse as we disembarked into the unknown, the silence of the abandoned base growing increasingly unsettling. Buildings stood like hollowed-out husks with windows shattered, doors ajar, a living town not even a few weeks ago, now just a ghost town. Robert ordered us in a whisper to stay sharp as we moved forward, our boots crunching on broken glass and debris. Signs of a struggle were everywhere, overturned furniture, bloodied rags, and scattered ammunition littered the ground, painting a picture of the chaos that had taken place here recently. The base, once a bustling hub of military activity, was eerily silent now except for our own shallow breaths and the distant echoing cry of the numbers broadcast. As we neared the command center, the transmission grew louder, a constant chant that seemed to bore into my mind, its meaning as elusive as the shadows in the fog surrounding us. Entering the command center, we found it abandoned, the air stale, the only light coming from the blinking consoles. The radio speakers crackling with static repeated the sequence over and over in a monotone voice, 58247, 5824. "Corporal Titus, what does it mean?" I saw her eyes wide as she scanned the room. "Commander Donald might have known," Robert said. Commander Donald was the name of the unit's leader who had vanished along with his team. We continued our search through the desolate base, hoping to find a clue, a survivor, anything. But it was the laboratory that changed everything. The door was ajar, hanging off its hinges as if forced open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay and chemicals. Shattered vials and overturned equipment were signs of activity halted abruptly. Then we saw them, bodies, members of Bravo unit, or what was left of them, sprawled across the floor, their faces contorted in expressions of terror. It was a massacre, but the cause was unclear. No bullet wounds, no signs of struggle on their remains. Then Titus gestured toward a corner of the room. There, amidst the pile of research notes and hastily abandoned experiments, lay the body of Commander Donald. Clutched in his stiff, lifeless hand was a notepad, the numbers 58247 scrawled across it in shaky handwriting, followed by a single chilling sentence, "They're coming for us." The revelation struck us like a physical blow, the implications of his words spiraling into a million questions with no answers. Who was coming for them? Was this distress call not a beacon of hope but a warning? It was then that the reality situation descended upon us, the isolation, the eerie silence broken only by that relentless strain of numbers. We were not the rescuers, we were the next victims. Panic set in as the base seemed to close in on us. The fog outside felt like it was thickening. Our only choice was to flee. We ran, stumbling through the fog, guided by the distant light of our vehicle. The numbers continued to echo in my mind, a chant that seemed to follow us, whispering through the fog. Just as the vehicle came into view, a shadow emerged from the mist. A chill colder than death itself crawled up my spine as the strange man, cloaked in shadow, moved towards us. "We need to go now," Robert's shout snapped me back to reality, the urgency in his voice mirroring a primal fear within me. Our training had prepared us for many different types of enemies, but we had no idea what we were dealing with here. We scrambled into the vehicle. Titus's hands were shaking as she manned the communications with obvious fear and shaking in her voice. "This is Stephen Unit calling command. Mayday, Mayday. We need immediate extraction from Zone Bravo. Do you copy? Over." The radio crackled, the numbers interrupting her plea for help. 58247. I couldn't shake the feeling that those numbers held some kind of meaning to what we had stumbled into. As the base faded into the distance, swallowed by the fog, so too did the person who emerged from the shadows. Yet the terror it inspired lingered. As we raced toward an uncertain future, Robert broke the silence and said, "We can't let this end here. We need to find out what those numbers mean and what happened to Bravo Unit." I wanted nothing more than to find these things out as well. I felt like we owed it to them, thinking of the twisted, lifeless bodies we'd left behind. As the first light of dawn began to pierce the darkness, I felt a grim determination settle over me. We had survived the night, but the real battle felt like it was just beginning. Armed with nothing but a string of numbers and the haunting memories of what we had witnessed, the mystery of those numbers and the horrors of what could have happened to Bravo Unit still remain a mystery. It stays with me, haunting me. I'm sure it stays with everyone from my unit. The horrors at that base were just a chapter in a story far greater and more terrifying than any of us could have imagined. I grew up during the 1960s in a fairly large North English town. It was a nice place to grow up, and I liked it very much. But when I turned 16, my mom and dad told me I needed to start paying rent. Luckily for me, my mom had already gone and sorted me out with a job. The only problem was it was down at the local hairdresser's. It wasn't a bad job, all I did was sweep up hair, and I could have as many biscuits and cups of tea as I wanted. But unfortunately for me, being a boy and working in a ladies' hairdresser's meant that the other kids my age began to spread rumors about me. I'm almost certain you'll be able to guess what those rumors were. For the most part, I didn't give a monkey's bottom what anyone thought about me. Only I did care about one person who thought about me, and her name was Lucy. Lucy was the prettiest girl in my street, and when I realized Lucy might think that I was batting for the other team, I just couldn't have that. So one day, as I was walking home from the hairdresser's, I bumped into Lucy, who was on her way to the corner shop. She asked if I really did work in a ladies' hairdresser's, emphasizing the word ladies for maximum humiliation. When I answered yes, she followed up by asking if I liked working there. This forced me to think on my feet. I told her no, I didn't like working in the hairdresser's, and I was actually on my way to join the army the very next morning. Lucy seemed awfully impressed by this, which was fantastic in the short term, but I was also faced with the long-term problem of having to actually apply to keep my word. So that's how I joined the army, to impress a girl, assuming I could just leave if I didn't take to it. Only I did take to it. Soldiering was bloody hard work, but I loved it, and I don't think I can really explain why outside of reeling off the usual cliches. But they're true. You make the best friends you ever have in your life, then you blow things up with them. As a teenage boy, what's not to love? I kept in touch with Lucy for a while after I was sent to live on base, but after a while, her life moved on, and mine moved on too. Lucy moved on to some fancy university down in London, whereas I moved on to North Ireland. In the late summer of 1970, myself and the rest of Lancashire regiments for battalion were sent to Belfast, North Ireland's heavily divided capital city. For those that don't know, the mostly Catholic IRA were at the throats of rival Protestant paramilitaries, and the mistrust among civilians in both communities led to a very volatile kind of segregation. They didn't want to live together, but they also couldn't stop fighting. Our mission was to keep the two warring parties separate. But as time went on, we increasingly sided with Protestant paramilitaries since their loyalties lay with the UK. The whole thing was a bloody great mess that never should have happened in the first place, but we got sent there, so we all just tried to make the best of it, don't get shot, come home in one piece, and really, nothing else mattered. We were billeted in a place called barracks, which was right next to prison. We used to joke about not being able to tell the difference between the two and how the food in Kremlin was probably better than the stuff we were getting. There was also very little for us to do with the barracks. It was great if you liked table football, pool, or reading, but anyone with a pulse was itching to get into Belfast city centre whenever weekend passes were handed out. Mainly so we could go down to the local pubs to relieve the stress of living and working in a bloody war zone. Only, this war zone was unlike any other British forces had ever operated in. The older blokes in our company had served in places like Aden or Malaya, big open deserts or thick jungles where you could use all your core soldiering skills. But there we were, operating in an actual city full of innocent people, and even more jarring was the fact that it was a city within our own national borders. Before I left, my mom and dad were telling me to look after myself and all this other stuff like I was headed halfway around the world. I remember telling them something like, "I'll be fine. We're not even leaving the bloody country." Looking back on it, I can't believe I was so bloody naive because although we were only across the Irish Sea and still technically in British territory, serving in Northern Ireland felt like we were a very long way from home. That kind of stress had younger lads like me longing for the comfort of the familiar, and to an Englishman, nothing is more familiar or more comforting than a good pub. I'm sure this is news to no one, but the Irish quite enjoy a little tipple, so the Corn Market area of the city centre had one on almost every corner. They were magnificent places too, some of them almost 100 years old with intricate stained glass panels behind the bar. There were some good pubs back home, don't get me wrong, but the Irish took things up a gear when it came to proper community pubs. All you had to do was find one with a "Soldier's Welcome" sign, and you were in for a ruddy good evening. I used to visit this one place quite regularly during my first tour, and I got to know the landlady and the regulars quite well. But the real reason I used to frequent this particular pub so much, when there were definitely places to get a better pint of beer, was the pretty ginger girl who used to come in and talk to the soldiers sometimes. I heard her name was Jenny, but I was far too shy to try and talk to her. Instead, I just kept on darkening the pub doors, even if I had to go alone, until she finally came over to chat with me. She was a few years older than I was, in her early 20s when I was still 18, but she was really easy to talk to. After a few hours of chatting, she gave me her phone number and told me to give her a call whenever I intended to visit the pub. I ended up doing just that at one point and invited her to join myself and a few of the lads in my section for a few drinks. That's when she told me that, as much as she appreciated the invite, she'd rather see me alone. It was subtle, but I got the hint and I just about skipped back to my billets after arranging to meet her another time. I had to wait a whole 2 weeks to be issued another weekend pass, but the moment I did, I telephoned Jenny. It was really nerve-wracking having her dad answer the phone, but when he realized I was the soldier she mentioned, cue the butterflies in my stomach, he grew very friendly and then handed the call over to her. We chatted for a few minutes, then I told her that I was finally free to meet alone. She sounded very excited, and her enthusiasm was very infectious. But after we arranged a date and time and I hung up the phone, something just didn't sit right with me. Jenny had mentioned living alone in a flat above a shop, so why did her dad answer the phone? She later told me that he'd been visiting at the time I called and had to answer the phone because Jenny was busy making their tea. It was a reasonable explanation, but it wasn't strictly necessary. I was so excited to see her for a date, as my kids would call it, that I didn't stop to consider that something might have been off. I didn't tell a soul about the meeting either. I didn't want anything to ruin my chances with Jenny, and as silly as that seems looking back on it, you might have noticed my habit of making silly decisions in the pursuit of romance. So, on the evening in question, I met up with her and we had a lovely time. When it came to about 9 o'clock, I offered to walk her back to her flat. It was only around the corner, so it wasn't like it was far, but when we got outside, she asked if I wanted to come inside to have another drink or two. It was like all my birthdays had come at once, and I'd never felt so high in all my young life. I remember trying to keep cool as I said yes, but I know I betrayed how thrilled I actually was. We went upstairs, had a few drinks, and then, when the right moment came, I moved in for my first ever kiss. I won't bore you with all the gory details, but we ended up taking things to our bedroom, where more and more of our clothes came off until there was very little else to strip. Then, right before I thought the fireworks were about to commence, Jenny told me that she had to pop to the loo, then disappeared from the room to do God only knows what. I waited there for a few minutes, and the door opened just a crack. I heard Jenny tell me to close my eyes. I must have had the biggest grin on my face as I did so, assuming that I was going to be opening them to the sight of her standing in front of me, maybe even wearing some kind of racy lingerie or something. But as the seconds ticked by, I didn't hear a thing. No opening of the door, no footsteps on the carpet, no cheeky Belfast brogue telling me to open my eyes. Nothing but silence. Finally, I heard the door open, but instead of the gentle padding of bare female feet, the footsteps were much, much heavier. I remember a flash of fear going through me at the sound of those footsteps, and when I opened my eyes, that fear grew tenfold. I caught a glimpse of two men, both in balaclavas and dark green jackets, before the man in front of me punched me so hard that I fell off the bed. The next thing I knew, they were forcing some kind of bag over my head, and before I had a chance to get that off, one of the blokes pinned me down while the other started stamping on my head. I assumed they were stamping on my head, anyway whatever they were hitting me with was bloody hard. The next thing I remember, I wasn't being pinned down anymore, and one guy was saying to the other, "That's enough, he's out cold now." I wasn't out cold, but I definitely wasn't in a position to defend myself. My one overriding thought was, this is it, I'm gonna die. They were obviously IRA, or at least someone who had ill intentions for me, and they'd caught me half naked and very drunk with no means of defending myself. But then, when the one bloke said, "Enough," I realized that they weren't going to kill me, not right away, anyway. I have no idea what kind of hell they intended to put me through, but they still needed to get me from A to B first, and that gave me a chance to escape. At first, I stayed lying on the carpet on the side of the bed because I was physically and mentally in shock. As the IRA men started talking back and forth with each other, I listened in and played dead, so to speak. Instead of keeping me prisoner in the flat, the men planned to move me to some other location. One was going to get the car ready, with the other telling him to bring it right up to the door of the house, while the other intended to tie my wrists and ankles before dragging me downstairs. That was their second big mistake. If they both focused on keeping control of me and tying me up, I might not have made it home. But working on the assumption that I was out for the count, they split up and gave me my opening. I waited until I heard one bloke head downstairs and stayed still until the other leaned down to start binding my wrists. I stayed nice and floppy until just the right moment, then I whipped the bag off and started to fight back. Now, I might seem like a bit of a cliche, but my training really did just kick in and take over. All that hand-to-hand training we'd done back home paid off big time, and I managed to get enough leverage to inflict some pretty nasty damage on the man's face by gouging his cheek and eye, just like our sergeant major had taught us to do back in training. The rest is a bit of a blur, but I do remember opening the bedroom window and shimmying out onto the lower roof just as the second IRA man came back upstairs to check on the first. I somehow managed to get down to ground level without breaking or spraining anything. When I realized I could still run, that's all I did until I reached a main road. Then it was only a matter of time until I reached a British checkpoint. Some military policemen, or red caps as we called them, drove me back to the barracks, assuming that I just had one heck of a wild night. When we arrived, I was then told to clean myself up, get some sleep, and to expect a disciplinary hearing in the morning. I was so glad to be back on safe ground that I just nodded, went to the shower block, and then drifted off to sleep after the adrenaline crash. The next morning, I was told to report to my company's sergeant major's office, where the man himself was waiting for me along with the MP who had driven me back to the base. Again, I think they just expected me to shrug my shoulders and make some excuses to why I ended up drunk and half-naked in the corn market, but as I told them what actually happened, both of them had to pick their jaws up off the floor. When I'd finished, I had some nasty bruising on my face to back up my story, and I gave up so many intricate little details that they knew I couldn't have been making it up. The MP still double-checked everything just in case I made up some elaborate lie, but one phone call to the pub me and Jenny had been at confirmed at least one major chunk of my story. They basically let slip at my next hearing that they believed the rest of my story too. Although they were well within their rights to send me to the glass house or army prison, I was going to be let off with a slap on the wrist on account of what I'd already suffered. I was confined to barracks for a while, and the whole company got hit with a 3-week drinking ban, which made everyone hate me for a while. But I was alive. We started getting briefings telling us to be careful who we associated with, how the IRA had spies and hitmen out there just waiting to ambush us in our cities. They hoped it would stop it from happening again, but young men remain young men no matter where they're from or what year it is. A few years later, someone else fell for the same trick that I did, and it actually cost them their lives. I didn't touch a single drop of alcohol for the entire rest of my tour, and whenever I got leave, I spent it in the gym or in the Nafi. After we got back, I spent a few more years in the services, but I got out before they could send me back to Northern Ireland again. After that, I didn't tell anyone that story for 15 years, not until I met my wife. Even then, I waited until we were married. Mine isn't the kind of war story you tell in pubs so you can drink for free. Mine was something I was ashamed of. I was young and stupid and had been easily tricked. The thing that really hurt the most was that a pretty girl had made me feel handsome, interesting, and funny, and it all was just some big lie.